The afternoon sun cast golden ribbons across the manicured lawn of the Morrison estate, where 20 children shrieked with laughter around an inflatable castle. Wendy Morrison stood on the terrace, champagne flute in hand, watching her son Wesley chase his best friend through a maze of designer party decorations. At 6 years old, Wesley had his father's dark curls and her green eyes that sparkled with mischief as he darted between clusters of well-dressed parents. She smiled, making a mental note to tell Jonathan about the way their son had insisted on inviting every child in his class, not just the ones from appropriate families. "Mrs. Morrison?" The event coordinator appeared at her elbow, tablet in hand. "The magician is ready for the grand finale." Wendy nodded, setting down her glass. "Perfect timing. Let me gather the children." But when she turned back to the lawn, her heart made a small anxious flutter. She could see Wesley's friend Lyle, could see the Johnson twins and the Whitmore girl, could see every child except the one who mattered most. "Wesley," she called, her voice steady despite the tightening in her chest. "Wesley, sweetie, the magic show is starting." The other children began streaming toward the white tent erected near the rose garden. Lyle looked around, confused. "Mrs. Morrison, Wesley said he was going to get his Iron Man toy from the house. He wanted to show me." Wendy's heels clicked against the terrace stones as she moved toward the house, telling herself there was no reason to worry. The Morrison mansion had 23 rooms, and Wesley knew every hiding spot. He was probably in his bedroom, distracted by his extensive toy collection. But he wasn't in his bedroom, or the playroom, or the kitchen, where the catering staff prepared miniature quiches and fruit sculptures. "Jonathan!" Wendy's voice cracked as she called for her husband, who emerged from his study with his phone pressed to his ear. "Hold on," he said into the phone, then covered the mouthpiece. "What's wrong?" "I can't find Wesley." The words hung between them like a held breath. Jonathan's face shifted from annoyance at the interruption to confusion to something harder, more alert. "What do you mean you can't find him? He was just outside." "I know where he was. He's not there now. Lyle said he came inside to get a toy, but he's not in his room. He's not." Her voice was rising, cracking at the edges. Jonathan dropped his phone onto the nearest table. "How long has it been?" 10 minutes, 15. They searched together, calling his name with increasing urgency. The catering staff joined in, then the party guests, then everyone. The music stopped. The magician packed up his doves and disappearing cards. 20 children were collected by worried parents, while the Morrison mansion transformed into a maze of opening doors and checking closets and looking under beds. After 30 minutes, Jonathan called the police. An hour later, Detective Maggie Ford arrived with 3 squad cars. She questioned Wendy, Jonathan, some remaining guests, and the mansion staff. No one had seen Wesley after he left to fetch a toy. 2 hours later, Wesley's face was on the local news. Later, Wendy sat on the terrace steps. Mascara streaked down her cheeks as she stared at the deflated bounce castle. The golden afternoon had turned to twilight, then to darkness. Somewhere in that darkness was her son. "Mrs. Morrison," Detective Ford crouched beside her, her voice gentle but firm. "I need you to think very carefully. Did Wesley mention anything unusual recently? Anyone new at school? Anyone paying extra attention to him?" Wendy shook her head, the movement mechanical. "No, nothing. He's 6 years old. He talks about Pokemon and what they served for lunch and whether Lyle can come over. Just normal things." "What about the party? Did you notice anyone who shouldn't have been here?" "Everyone was invited, parents, siblings. The vendors were all from companies we've used before." Wendy's hands twisted in her lap. "How does a child just disappear from a birthday party with 50 people here? How does that happen?" Detective Ford had no answer. In her 12 years on the force, she'd learned that terrible things happened in the spaces between attention, in the seconds when everyone looked away at once. The search continued through the night. K9 units tracked Wesley's scent to the edge of the property, where it stopped abruptly at the road. No one had seen a car, no one had heard anything unusual. It was as if he'd simply evaporated into the summer air. Jonathan stood in Wesley's bedroom at 3 a.m, holding his son's favorite stuffed elephant. The room still smelled like the coconut shampoo Wesley used, still had his clothes scattered on the floor from that morning when getting dressed had seemed like the biggest challenge he'd faced that day. "We'll find him," he said to the empty room. "We'll find you, buddy, I promise." But promises made to empty rooms have a way of echoing back unanswered. 12 months later, Wendy Morrison moved through her days like a ghost in her own life. The mansion had become a mausoleum, every room a shrine to the child who'd vanished. Wesley's bedroom remained untouched, his bed made, his toys arranged exactly as they'd been that morning. The toy Iron Man he'd gone to fetch still sat on his shelf, waiting. She'd stopped working within a month of the disappearance. How could she focus on architectural designs when her son's face stared at her from every missing child poster in the city? She'd stopped sleeping normally too, keeping odd hours, sometimes walking through the house at 2 a.m, opening doors as if Wesley might somehow be behind one of them. Jonathan had gone the opposite direction, burying himself in work with an intensity that bordered on obsession. Morrison Financial Holdings had expanded aggressively over the past year. 3 new acquisitions, a merger, endless 18-hour days. When Wendy accused him of running away, he'd snapped back that someone had to keep everything from falling apart. They'd become strangers who shared a house and a tragedy. The investigation had gone cold after 6 months. Detective Ford still called once a week, but Wendy could hear the defeat in her voice. There had been no ransom demand, no credible sightings, no evidence of what had happened after Wesley reached that road. The FBI had been involved, then quietly stepped back. Some cases stayed open, but stopped moving forward. The Morrisons had spent over $2 million on private investigators, psychics, age progression software, and billboard campaigns. They'd been on every major news program. Wendy's tearful pleas had been shared millions of times across social media, but Wesley remained gone, swallowed by a mystery that refused to yield its secrets. On the anniversary of his disappearance, they held a vigil. Hundreds of people attended, some who'd known Wesley, most who hadn't. Wendy stood beside Jonathan, holding a candle, listening to a minister talk about hope and faith. The words meant nothing. Hope was something that belonged to people whose children came home. That same afternoon, 8 miles away in a part of the city the Morrisons had never visited, Carmen Rodriguez was fighting her own battles. The eviction notice had been taped to her door that morning, bright orange, impossible to miss. 30 days to come up with $1,200, or she and her daughter Jo would be on the street. Carmen sat at her kitchen table, the notice in front of her, calculator beside it trying to make numbers add up that refused to cooperate. Her waitressing job at the diner brought in about $1,800 a month when she got good tips. Rent was $1,200, which left $600 for everything else: food, utilities, Jo's school supplies, the bus pass she needed to get to work, the medication she couldn't quite afford for the asthma that made every breath a conscious effort. She'd picked up extra shifts, but her manager said she was at maximum hours. She'd applied for assistance, but the waiting list was 6 months. She'd asked her sister, but Eleanor was barely surviving herself with 3 kids and a husband who drank away his paycheck. Carmen pressed her palms against her eyes, fighting the burn of tears. She'd cried enough for one lifetime, and tears didn't pay rent. "Mama!" Jo appeared in the kitchen doorway, 8 years old with her hair in the braids Carmen had done that morning before her shift. "Can we go play in the woods, please? All my friends are going." The woods, a stretch of overgrown forest along the river where the neighborhood kids played. It was free entertainment, which was about all Carmen could afford. She glanced at the clock. 3 hours before her evening shift started. "Okay, baby, but stay where I can see you and stay away from the river. It's high from all that rain." Joe's face lit up with a smile that made every struggle worthwhile. "I promise, thank you, Mama." Carmen watched her daughter run to grab her shoes, feeling her heart expand and break simultaneously. Joe deserved so much more than this, more than eviction notices and free lunch programs, and a mother who worked herself to exhaustion and still couldn't make ends meet. But all Carmen could give her was love, and she gave that in abundance. They walked to the woods together, Carmen carrying a book she'd borrowed from the library, Joe skipping ahead with the boundless energy of childhood. Other children were already there. Lyle from Joe's class, the Ford twins, a handful of others. Their parents sat on fallen logs or leaned against trees, stealing a few moments of community while their kids explored. "1 hour," Carmen called as Joe ran off. "Then I have to get ready for work." "Okay, Mama." Carmen settled against an oak tree, opening her book, but not really reading. Her mind kept circling back to that orange notice, to the impossible math of her life. Maybe she could sell her car, but then how would she get to work? Maybe she could ask her boss for an advance, but she'd already done that twice. Maybe... "Mom!" The scream cut through the afternoon, sharp with panic. "Mrs. Rodriguez, come quick!" Carmen dropped her book and ran toward Joe's voice, her heart already racing. The other parents were running too, all of them converging on the riverbank where the children stood in a tight cluster pointing at something. No, not something. Someone. At the edge of the water, tangled in roots and mud, lay a small figure. A child. Unconscious and soaking wet, so still that for a horrible moment Carmen thought they were too late. "Call 911!" one of the other mothers shouted, already pulling out her phone, but Carmen was closer. She slid down the muddy bank, her waitress uniform stained with mud and filth. She reached the child. A boy, maybe 6 or 7 years old, dressed in clothes that had once been expensive, but were now torn and stained beyond recognition. His skin was pale, lips tinged blue. But when she pressed her fingers to his neck, she felt a pulse, faint but there. "He's alive," she called up to the others. "He's breathing, but barely." "Ambulance is coming," someone shouted back. 10 minutes. 10 minutes. Carmen looked at the boy's face, partially obscured by mud and matted hair. 10 minutes might be too late. She'd done a first aid course years ago, back when she'd thought she might become a nurse, before life had narrowed her options to surviving day by day. She checked his airway. Clear. Checked his breathing. Shallow but present. Checked for obvious injuries. Nothing she could see, but that didn't mean much. He was hypothermic, that was certain. Even in summer the river was cold, and he was soaked through. "Give me someone's jacket," she called up. "Anything dry and warm." Coats rained down. Carmen stripped off the boy's wet shirt and wrapped him in layers, rubbing his arms to try to stimulate circulation. His eyelids fluttered, but didn't open. "Come on, baby," she whispered. "Stay with me. Whatever happened, you survived it. Don't give up now." Joe appeared at the top of the bank, her face streaked with tears. "Mama, is he going to be okay?" "I don't know, sweetheart, but we're going to try our hardest." The ambulance took 12 minutes. By the time it arrived, the boy's color had improved slightly, his breathing less labored. The paramedics loaded him onto a stretcher, while firing questions Carmen couldn't answer. She didn't know his name, didn't know how long he'd been in the water, didn't know anything except that someone's child had nearly died, and she'd been there to help. "You saved his life, Ma'am," one paramedic said as they loaded the stretcher. "If you hadn't found him when you did..." He didn't finish the sentence. Carmen watched the ambulance pull away, lights flashing. Around her, the other parents were gathering their children, hugging them tighter. Joe pressed against her side, and Carmen wrapped her arm around her daughter. "Who do you think he is?" Joe asked quietly. "I don't know, baby, but I hope someone is looking for him." They walked home in silence, Carmen's mind churning. That boy had been in the water, but he'd also been near the riverbank as if he'd crawled there. From where? How long had he been out there, and why did something about him tug at her memory, like a name on the tip of her tongue? That night, Carmen couldn't sleep. She lay in her narrow bed staring at the water-stained ceiling of her cramped apartment, seeing the boy's pale face every time she closed her eyes. After her shift at the diner, she'd tried calling the hospital, but they wouldn't give her any information since she wasn't family. At 2 a.m., she gave up on sleep and turned on the television, keeping the volume low so she wouldn't wake Joe. A late-night news program was showing a story she'd seen a dozen times before, the anniversary vigil for Wesley Morrison, the wealthy family's son who'd vanished a year ago. Carmen watched the footage of hundreds of candles, of Wesley's mother Wendy breaking down during her speech, of the father standing rigid beside her, like a man made of stone. They showed Wesley's picture again, those bright green eyes, that mischievous smile, dark curls falling across his forehead. Dark curls. Carmen sat up so fast she nearly knocked over her water glass. She grabbed her phone searching for the story, pulling up every image of Wesley Morrison she could find. 6 years old when he disappeared. He would be 7 now, dark hair, green eyes. The boy from the river had been covered in mud, his hair matted and filthy, but underneath the grime it had been dark, and she'd only caught the briefest glimpse of his eyes when they'd fluttered, but she'd thought they might have been green. "No," she whispered to her empty room. "That's impossible, isn't it?" But her hands were already shaking as she searched for more information. The Morrison case had been everywhere a year ago. A child vanishing from a birthday party at a mansion in Ashford Heights, the wealthy enclave on the opposite side of the city from Carmen's neighborhood. There were massive search efforts with FBI involvement, private investigators. Millions of dollars were spent on trying to find him, and then nothing. No clues, no answers. The story had faded from the headlines after a few months, becoming just another tragedy in a world full of them. Carmen looked at the orange eviction notice still sitting on her kitchen table. She thought about the reward money she'd seen mentioned in the old articles. $1 million for information leading to Wesley's recovery. $1 million would solve every problem she had and create a future for Joe she'd only dreamed about. But she also thought about that boy's pulse under her fingers, weak but fighting. She thought about how someone's child, maybe this child, had been missing for a year while his parents suffered. She thought about Wendy Morrison's face at that vigil, destroyed by grief. Carmen grabbed her jacket. The hospital's emergency room was quieter at 2:30 a.m. than during the day, but still busy enough that Carmen had to wait 20 minutes before she could corner a nurse. "I'm sorry, I need to know about the boy brought in this afternoon from the river. Is he okay?" The nurse, a woman in her 50s with kind eyes and tired features, looked Carmen up and down. "Are you family?" "No, I'm the one who found him. I just need to know if he's all right." The nurse's expression softened. "He's stable, critical but stable. We've got him on warming protocols and IV fluids. No ID, no one's claimed him yet." "No one?" Carmen's heart sank. If he was Wesley Morrison, why hadn't anyone made the connection? "Can I see him?" "Visiting hours are—" "Please." Carmen surprised herself with the intensity of her plea. "Just for a minute. I pulled him out of that water. I just need to see that he's okay." The nurse studied her for a long moment, then sighed. "Room 247, 5 minutes, and if anyone asks, you didn't hear it from me." Carmen navigated the hospital corridors with her heart pounding. Room 247 was in the pediatric wing, the walls painted with cheerful murals that seemed obscene given the suffering they tried to mask. She pushed open the door slowly, half afraid of what she'd find. The boy lay in the bed, small and fragile against the white sheets. He'd been cleaned up, his hair washed, revealing dark curls that caught the light from the monitors. An oxygen tube ran beneath his nose. IVs snaked from his arms. But he was breathing, and there was color in his cheeks that hadn't been there on the riverbank. Carmen moved closer, her trained waitress instincts making her steps quiet. In the better lighting, cleaned up, his features were clearer. The shape of his face, the curve of his nose, the dark lashes against his cheeks. She pulled out her phone with trembling hands, bringing up Wesley Morrison's picture. She looked from the screen to the boy in the bed and back again. Her breath caught. It was him. She was almost certain it was him, a year older, thinner, marked by whatever nightmare he'd endured. But the bone structure was the same, the features recognizable. Wesley Morrison was alive. Carmen backed out of the room, her mind racing. She should call someone. The police, the hospital administration, the Morrisons themselves. This was their child, their missing son, their miracle. But as she stood in the corridor, she thought about what would happen next. The media storm, the investigations, and this boy, this traumatized child who'd somehow survived a year of goodness knows what, would be thrust into the center of it all. She thought about the nurse saying no one had claimed him yet. How long before someone at the hospital made the connection? How long before this small, fragile miracle became a circus? Carmen made a decision that would change everything. She walked back to the nurse's station, where the kind-eyed nurse was entering data into a computer. "Excuse me," Carmen said quietly. "That boy in 247. Has anyone from social services been by yet?" The nurse shook her head. "Won't be until Monday. We're short-staffed on weekends. Why?" "I was thinking, if no one claims him, if he ends up in the system..." Carmen swallowed hard. "I'd like to be considered as a foster placement. I have a daughter his age. I've already been approved for foster care." This was a lie, but one she'd make true as fast as humanly possible. "He knows me. I was there when we found him. Maybe having a familiar face would help." The nurse's expression was skeptical. "That's very kind, but there are procedures. I know, I pulled him from that river. I feel responsible for him somehow, like fate put me there at that exact moment for a reason." Carmen met the nurse's eyes. "Please, just put it in his file, that someone is willing to take him if he needs a place to go." After a long moment, the nurse nodded. "I'll make a note, but don't get your hopes up. These things are complicated." Carmen thanked her and left, stepping out into the pre-dawn darkness. She knew what she was doing was crazy. She knew it was probably wrong, but something in her gut told her that this boy needed time before being thrown back into whatever life he'd come from. He needed healing that wouldn't happen under camera flashes and police interrogations. And yes, part of her thought about that $1 million reward. But mostly, she thought about the feel of his pulse under her fingers, the way he'd fought to survive whatever had happened to him. She would give him time. A little time to recover, to be just a boy instead of a headline, and then she'd do the right thing. At least, that's what she told herself. The call came on Tuesday. Carmen had spent Monday filing emergency foster care paperwork, calling in every favor she had, and somehow, through a combination of bureaucratic luck and divine intervention, getting approved on a temporary basis. "Mrs. Rodriguez, this is Children's Services. We have a placement for you if you're still willing. The boy from the river, no family has come forward, and he's being discharged from the hospital today. Given your prior relationship and our current shortage of available homes, we're wondering if you could take him for a few weeks while we investigate his case." Carmen's hand tightened on the phone. "Yes, of course. When should I come?" 3 hours later, she was signing paperwork while the boy sat in a wheelchair beside her, staring at nothing. The doctors said he was physically recovering well. No serious injuries, just malnutrition and exposure. But he hadn't spoken, hadn't responded to questions, hadn't even told them his name. Trauma-induced selective mutism, one doctor called it. Whatever he'd been through, his mind had built walls to protect itself. Those walls included silence. Carmen knelt beside the wheelchair, bringing herself to his eye level. Those green eyes finally focused on her face, and she saw something there, but it faded just as fast. "Hi," she said softly. "I'm Carmen. You're going to stay with me for a while, okay? You'll be safe. I promise you'll be safe." He blinked but didn't respond. Carmen hadn't expected him to. She'd made a decision during the sleepless nights since finding him. She wouldn't tell anyone who he was, not yet. He needed time to heal, to feel safe, to find his voice again. Once the world knew Wesley Morrison was alive, that chance would be gone forever. The media would devour him. The questions would never stop. And maybe there was a reason he'd ended up in that river. A reason he'd been missing for a year. What if the truth was worse than anyone suspected? What if going back to his old life meant putting him in danger? These were the justifications Carmen told herself. They felt noble, but underneath was another truth she didn't want to examine. The longer she waited, the harder it would be to let him go. Joe was waiting when they got home, practically vibrating with excitement. Carmen had explained they'd be fostering the boy from the river for a while. Joe had immediately started planning how she'd share her room and which toys he might like. "Hi," Joe said brightly when Carmen wheeled him into their small apartment. "I'm Joe. You can have the bed. I'll sleep on the air mattress. Do you like Legos? I have some really cool ones, and Mama said we could get pizza for dinner if you want. Do you like pizza? Everyone likes pizza." The boy stared at Joe with wide eyes. Carmen watched something flicker across his face. Surprise, maybe, or the ghost of happiness at the mention of pizza. "Joe, baby, remember what we talked about? He's having a hard time right now. He might not talk for a while." "That's okay," Joe said simply. "I can talk enough for both of us." And she did. Over the next few days, Joe narrated their entire existence to their silent guest. She explained how the shower worked and which cereal was best, and why you had to knock before entering the bathroom. She showed him her school projects and her rock collection and the bird's nest she'd found in the woods. The boy, Carmen had started calling him Alex in her mind, unable to think of him as Wesley, mostly sat and watched. But gradually, tiny changes emerged. On the third day, when Joe offered him her favorite stuffed bear, he took it. On the fifth day, Carmen saw him almost smile at one of Joe's knock-knock jokes. On the seventh day, he fell asleep during a movie with his head on Carmen's shoulder. "He's getting better, isn't he?" Joe whispered that night while Carmen tucked her into the air mattress. "I think so, baby, but it takes time." "Mama!" Joe's voice dropped lower. "Do you think his parents are looking for him?" Carmen's breath caught. "I'm sure they are." "Then we have to find them. He needs his family." 8 years old, and Joe understood what Carmen had been trying to ignore. This wasn't their child to keep. He belonged somewhere else, to someone else. That night, unable to sleep, Carmen did something she'd been avoiding. She Googled Wesley Morrison's name, diving deep into the anniversary coverage. She read every article, watched every video, absorbed every detail of his disappearance, and she found something that made her blood run cold. 3 months before Wesley disappeared, his parents had finalized a contentious divorce. They'd reconciled 2 months later, according to society pages, but the divorce filing was public record, and it painted a picture of a marriage torn apart by Jonathan Morrison's affair with his secretary and Wendy's subsequent breakdown. The reconciliation had been sudden, rushed, the kind of thing that happened when two people realized they needed each other more than they hated each other, or when they needed to present a united front. Carmen read further, finding smaller articles buried in the archives. Questions about Jonathan Morrison's business dealings, allegations of fraud that had been quietly settled, and one interview with a former employee who suggested the Morrisons' perfect life was a carefully constructed facade. She closed her laptop, feeling sick. Maybe she was reaching, seeing conspiracy where there was only tragedy, but what if she wasn't? What if Wesley had disappeared for a reason, and going back meant putting him in danger? 2 weeks into his stay, Alex spoke for the first time. Carmen was making breakfast when she heard a small, scratchy voice that barely qualified as a whisper. "Thank you." She turned from the stove. Alex sat at their battered kitchen table, holding the plate of pancakes she'd set in front of him. His eyes met hers, and they were bright with tears. "You're welcome, sweetheart," Carmen managed, her own throat tight. "You're so welcome." Joe burst into the kitchen, having heard from the other room. "You talked! Alex, you talked! Say something else! Say my name!" He looked at Joe, and this time the smile was real, if small. Joe. It was like a dam breaking. Over the next few days, words trickled out. Short sentences, simple requests. He didn't talk about where he'd been or what had happened. When Carmen gently asked about his family, his face went blank and the walls came back up. But he talked about the present. He talked about liking chocolate ice cream and being afraid of the dark and thinking Joe was funny. He talked like a child learning to be a child again. Carmen watched him heal and felt her own heart breaking, because every day he got better was a day closer to when she'd have to give him back. Every smile he gave Joe was a reminder that he wasn't theirs to keep. The eviction notice deadline came and went. Carmen had called her landlord, explained the situation, begged for more time. He'd given her 2 more weeks. She'd picked up every shift she could, but foster care payments hadn't started yet, and the numbers still didn't add up. On the night before they would have to leave, Carmen sat at the kitchen table with her head in her hands. Alex and Joe were asleep in the other room. The orange notice was now joined by a red one. Final warning. She thought about that $1 million reward. One phone call would solve everything, would give Joe the life she deserved, would fund Alex's therapy, his recovery, whatever he needed. But it would also end this brief time where he'd been safe and healing and learning to smile again. Once she made that call, he'd be Wesley Morrison again, thrust back into a world that had already failed him once. Carmen pulled out her phone. She stared at it for a long time. Then she did something that surprised even herself. She called a lawyer. The lawyer's name was Thomas Radford. He took Carmen's case pro bono after she explained the situation, not the whole situation. She didn't mention her suspicions about who Alex really was, but she told him about finding a traumatized child, about how foster care had placed him with her, and about how she was facing eviction. "There are programs," Thomas said, scrolling through his computer. "Emergency housing for foster families. It's not glamorous, but it would give you time to get on your feet." The house he found was on the edge of the woods, where they'd discovered Alex a tiny 2-bedroom cottage that had been used for park ranger housing decades ago. It had been sitting vacant for years, structurally sound but outdated, managed by the city's parks department. The rent was 1/3 what Carmen had been paying, offset by a stipend for foster parents. "It's isolated," Thomas warned. "No close neighbors, but the school district is actually better than where you are now." Isolated sounded perfect to Carmen. Far from the city center, where someone might recognize Alex from the news coverage that had finally died down but never fully disappeared. They moved in on a Saturday. The cottage was small but clean, with actual bedrooms instead of one room divided by a curtain. Joe and Alex could each have their own space, though Joe insisted they keep their doors open at night, so we can talk. The woods were their backyard, the river visible through the trees. Alex had stiffened when he first saw it, but Joe had taken his hand. "It's okay," she'd said. "We won't go down there if you don't want to, right, Mama?" "Right," Carmen had agreed, though her heart ached at the fear in Alex's eyes. Whatever had happened to him involved that river. Maybe someday he'd be ready to talk about it. Life found a rhythm in that house in the woods. Carmen worked her shifts at the diner, while a distant neighbor, Mrs. Patterson, a grandmother whose own kids had grown, watched Alex and Joe after school. The kids thrived in the simplicity of it. They built forts in the woods, collected leaves, drew pictures on foggy windows. Alex slowly filled out, his hollow cheeks rounding, his eyes losing that haunted look. He started 3rd grade at the local school under the name Alex Rodriguez, forged documents that made Carmen's stomach turn, but felt necessary. He made friends, he laughed, he had nightmares sometimes, waking up screaming about dark places and cold water. But Carmen would go to him, hold him, tell him he was safe now. "You're safe," she'd whisper. "I've got you. No one's going to hurt you." And in those moments she believed she'd done the right thing. 3 months into their new life, Joe came home from school with a flyer. "Mama, look! They're doing a fall carnival fundraiser. Can we go? Can we?" Carmen took the flyer, scanning it. The carnival would be in the town centre, the nicer part of the city where the Morrisons lived. Risk assessment flickered through her mind. Crowds meant less chance of recognition, but it also meant more people who might have seen the news coverage. Alex was looking at the flyer too, his eyes bright with interest. He'd mentioned once, in passing, that he used to like carnivals. It was one of the few references he'd made to a before. "Okay," Carmen said, "we'll go." The carnival was everything autumn should be. Apple cider and pumpkin patches, a Ferris wheel lit up against the darkening sky. Alex held Carmen's hand tightly as they walked through the crowds. He was smiling, pointing at things he wanted to try. They were in line for the ring toss when a man's voice, sharp with disbelief, "Wesley!" Carmen felt Alex's hand clench in hers. She turned slowly, her heart dropping into her stomach. Jonathan Morrison stood 10 feet away, frozen in place, a woman Carmen didn't recognize beside him. His face had gone white, his eyes locked on Alex with an expression of such raw shock that it was almost painful to witness. "Wesley," he said again, his voice breaking. Then louder, anguished, "Wesley!" People were turning to look. The woman with Jonathan grabbed his arm, but he shook her off, taking a step forward. Alex shrank back against Carmen, his whole body trembling. "Sir," Carmen said, her voice steady despite her racing heart, "I think you're mistaken. This is Alex." "That's my son!" Jonathan's eyes never left Alex's face. "That's my son. Wesley, it's Dad. It's okay, you're safe now." But Alex wasn't acting like a child reunited with a beloved parent. He was shaking, his breath coming in short gasps, his face pale. Joe had moved to stand in front of him, her 8-year-old body a shield. "You're scaring him," Joe said fiercely. "Stop scaring him." A crowd was gathering. Someone pulled out a phone. Carmen's mind raced through options, all of them bad. If she ran, she'd look guilty. If she stayed, this moment would define everything that came after. She knelt beside Alex, her voice gentle. "Sweetheart, do you know this man?" Alex looked at Jonathan Morrison, and Carmen saw recognition in his eyes, but also fear. Deep, terrible fear that made her next decision easy. "Security!" Carmen called out. "This man is harassing my foster child." "Foster child?" Jonathan's voice rose to a shout. "That's my son! My son who's been missing for over a year. Someone call the police! Call them now!" The carnival security arrived, then actual police, then chaos. Alex wouldn't speak, just clung to Carmen, while Joe cried, and Jonathan Morrison alternated between demanding his son back and threatening to have Carmen arrested for kidnapping. At the police station, Carmen told her story. She'd found a boy by the river. No one had claimed him. She'd been given legal foster care placement. She had the paperwork to prove it. She didn't know he was Wesley Morrison. How could she have known? He wouldn't speak, wouldn't tell anyone who he was. It was a lie wrapped in enough truth to be believed. Jonathan told his story. His son had been missing for a year. He'd recognize him anywhere. This woman had stolen him. hidden him, kept him from his family. Between them sat Alex, small, silent, and terrified. Detective Maggie Ford, the same detective who'd worked Wesley's original disappearance, sat across from Carmen in an interrogation room. "The boy matches Wesley Morrison's DNA," she said quietly. "We fast-tracked the test. It's him." Carmen closed her eyes. Of course it was him. She'd known it from the first moment. "I didn't kidnap him." "But you suspected who he was, didn't you? When you found him." I thought he might be, but he was so scared, so traumatized, and no one had come forward to claim him. I thought..." Carmen's voice broke. "I thought he needed time to heal before being thrown back into whatever situation he'd come from." "What situation? You mean his family?" "I don't know. I don't know what happened to him, but did you see his face when he saw his father? That wasn't a happy reunion. That was a terrified child." Detective Ford leaned back. "Or it was a confused child who didn't recognize his father after a year of being held by someone else." "He wasn't being held. He was being cared for, loved, protected." "From his own parents?" Carmen met the detective's eyes. "I read about the case. The divorce right before he disappeared, the reconciliation, the business problems. I don't know what happened, but something about it felt wrong, and when I saw how scared he was of his father..." "You made a decision that wasn't yours to make." "I made a decision to keep a child safe." In another room, a child psychologist was talking to Alex. Gentle questions about where he'd been, what he remembered, whether he felt safe. Alex answered some questions, stayed silent for others, and when asked directly if he wanted to go home with his father, he said the words that would echo through the following weeks. "I want to stay with Carmen and Joe. I'd like to take a moment and pause. Thank you for joining me on this journey. Please show a kindness by clicking like and subscribe. It would help our channel so much." Let's continue our story. The news broke like a thunderstorm. Wesley Morrison missing for over a year, found alive and living with a foster mother who may or may not have known who he was. The media descended on the story with savage joy, turning it into every kind of narrative. Devoted mother refuses to give up search. Poor woman taken advantage of by wealthy family. Possible kidnapping. Possible conspiracy. The truth, as usual, was more complicated than any headline. Carmen wasn't arrested. The evidence wasn't there. She had legal foster care documents. The hospital and social services had placed Alex with her through proper channels, and crucially, Alex himself insisted he'd never told her his real name, never told her anything about his past. But public opinion was brutal. How could she not have recognized one of the most famous missing children in the country? How could she not have called the police immediately when she suspected? The answer was simple. She hadn't wanted to. She'd wanted to keep him safe, and in doing so, she'd kept him from the parents who'd been searching for him desperately. Wendy Morrison appeared on every news program that would have her. She wept, she begged. She described the year of hell she'd endured, the hope that had died a little more each day, the miracle of finding her son alive, and the cruelty of being kept from him. "She stole my child," Wendy said, her voice breaking. "She found my baby, and she kept him like he was hers. Do you know what that year did to me? Do you know what it's like to grieve a child who's actually alive, being cared for by someone else?" Jonathan was quieter, but no less determined. He hired the best lawyers money could buy. He demanded full custody. He wanted Carmen prosecuted to the fullest extent of the law. But something strange happened. As the case went to family court, as lawyers argued and media speculated, Alex's voice became impossible to ignore. He didn't want to go back. "I don't remember much about before," he told the child psychologist in recorded sessions that were submitted to the court. "But I remember being scared. I remember something bad happening, and when I saw him, my dad, I felt that scared feeling again." "Do you remember what you were scared of?" the psychologist asked gently. "Dark places, cold water, someone angry. I don't remember more than that." The psychologist, Dr. Lisa Martinez, submitted her professional opinion to the court. Wesley Morrison was suffering from trauma-induced partial amnesia. His memories of the year he'd been missing were fragmented at best, but his emotional memory, his fear response to his father, was real and significant. Forcing him back into his previous family situation without understanding what caused his initial trauma could be deeply harmful, Dr. Martinez wrote. "I recommend a gradual reintegration with extensive therapy and careful monitoring." The Morrisons' lawyers painted a different picture. Wesley had been brainwashed by Carmen Rodriguez. Stockholm Syndrome, parental alienation. She'd had him for 4 months, long enough to poison his mind against his real family. "This woman found our son and decided to keep him like a stray puppy," their lead attorney argued. "She played God with a child's life and a family's suffering. The fact that the child has bonded with his captor doesn't change the fundamental wrong here." Carmen couldn't afford a lawyer like the Morrisons had, but Thomas Radford stood beside her anyway, working pro bono with a team of law students and legal aid attorneys who believed in her cause. "My client didn't kidnap Wesley Morrison," Thomas argued. "She saved him. She pulled him from a river where he would have died. She nursed him back to health. She gave him a stable home when the system had nowhere else to put him. And yes, she should have called the police when she suspected who he was. But put yourself in her shoes. A child traumatized into silence, showing fear of his previous life, and a case file full of red flags about his family situation. Would you throw him back without understanding what he'd run from?" "He didn't run from anything," the Morrisons' lawyer countered. "He was taken, abducted. Whatever happened to him that year, it wasn't his parents' fault." "Then where was he?" Thomas demanded. "Someone had him for a year. Someone kept him, traumatized him, and then what? Let him go near a river to be found, or did he escape? Did he run from his captors and end up in that water trying to get away?" The question hung unanswered because Alex couldn't answer it. When asked directly about the missing year, his mind went blank. The doctors called it dissociative amnesia, his brain protecting him from memories too terrible to process. Joe testified too, at the judge's request. 8 years old, sitting in a chair that made her look even smaller, she told the court about finding Alex by the river, about how scared he'd been, about how he'd gradually learned to smile again. "He has nightmares," she said quietly. "He wakes up crying. Mama holds him until he feels safe again. If you take him away from Mama, who's going to hold him?" Even the Morrisons' lawyer didn't have the heart to cross-examine her harshly. But it was Wendy Morrison's testimony that broke through the public narrative. She took the stand pale and shaking, but when she spoke, her voice was clear. "I want my son back," she said. "I have wanted nothing else for a year, but I've been watching the recordings of his therapy sessions. I've seen how he looks when he talks about us, and I need to understand what happened before I can bring him home." The courtroom went silent. Even Jonathan Morrison stared at his wife in shock. "What are you saying?" the judge asked. Wendy's hands twisted in her lap. "I'm saying that something happened to Wesley. Something terrible, and until we understand what, until he feels safe enough to come home willingly, I don't want to force him. I want to fight for my son by fighting for what's best for him, not just fighting to win." "Wendy!" Jonathan hissed, but she ignored him. "My husband thinks I'm weak, but I watched my son disappear once. I won't watch him disappear inside himself because we forced him back before he was ready." The judge, a woman in her 60s who'd presided over family court for 20 years, looked at Wendy with something like respect. Then she looked at Alex, sitting between Carmen and Joe in the gallery, and made her ruling. "Joint custody," she declared. "The child will remain in Miss Rodriguez's care, but will have supervised visitation with the Morrisons twice weekly, increasing as the child becomes comfortable. Both families will participate in therapy, and if at any point Wesley Morrison recovers memories that explain his disappearance or his trauma, we'll reconvene to discuss permanent custody arrangements. It wasn't what anyone wanted, but it was what Alex needed. The first visit was a disaster. It took place in a neutral office, monitored by Dr. Martinez. Alex sat on a couch between Carmen and Joe, while Wendy and Jonathan sat across from them on chairs. The physical distance between them felt symbolic. Wendy had brought a photo album. "I thought, maybe if you saw pictures of our life together, it would help you remember." She opened the album carefully, turning pages to show Wesley, or Alex, as everyone now called him, as a baby, a toddler, on his first day of school. There he was at the birthday party where he'd disappeared, grinning at the camera in his Iron Man t-shirt. Alex stared at the pictures like they were of a stranger. "I don't remember," he whispered. "It's okay," Wendy said, though her voice shook. "We have time." But Jonathan's patience was thinner. "You have to remember something. This is your life, Wesley. This is your room, your toys, your parents. You can't just forget everything." Alex shrank back and Joe put her arm around him. Jonathan's face hardened. "This is exactly what I was afraid of. He's been turned against us." "No one turned him against you," Carmen said quietly. "He's scared. Can't you see that?" "Scared of what? His own parents who love him?" "Maybe scared of whatever happened before he disappeared, or during. We don't know Jonathan, and pushing him won't help us find out." The visit ended early with Alex in tears and Wendy and Jonathan arguing in the parking lot. Dr. Martinez made notes and adjusted the visitation plan. But slowly, painfully slowly, things began to change. Wendy came to the second visit alone. "Jonathan's working," she said, which they all knew was a lie, but without his presence, Alex was less tense. Wendy brought no photos this time, just a book. The Giving Tree, which she said used to be Wesley's favorite. "Would you like me to read it to you?" she asked. Alex nodded, and for 20 minutes Wendy read while Alex listened, and something in his face softened. At the end, he said, "I think I remember this. The tree makes me feel sad, but good." Wendy's eyes filled with tears, but she kept her voice steady. "That's exactly how you used to describe it." Over the following weeks, a fragile routine developed. Wendy visited twice a week, sometimes reading, sometimes just talking. She told Alex stories about his childhood, but framed them as, "This is what happened," rather than, "You must remember." She brought small things, a favorite stuffed animal, a baseball card collection, a photo of the family dog who died while he was gone. Each item sparked something. Not full memories, but feelings, impressions, a sense of recognition that felt like fog clearing slowly. Jonathan came less often, and when he did, he was trying harder to control his frustration. Dr. Martinez had been blunt with him. "Your son associates you with fear. Until we understand why, you pushing him will only make it worse." "I didn't do anything wrong," Jonathan insisted. "Then help us figure out who did." That conversation shifted something. Jonathan hired a private investigator to dig into Wesley's disappearance with fresh eyes, looking for connections they'd missed the first time. Meanwhile, in the house in the woods, Alex was changing in other ways. He'd always been quiet with Carmen and Joe, but his silences were becoming more thoughtful than fearful. He asked questions about his before life that suggested he was trying to piece together a puzzle with missing pieces. "Did I like my parents?" he asked Carmen one night. She chose her words carefully. "From everything I've read and what your mother tells me, yes. You loved them very much." "Then why am I so scared?" "I don't know, sweetheart, but being scared doesn't mean they're bad. Sometimes our brains protect us in ways we don't understand. Maybe when you're ready, you'll remember why you're scared, and it'll make sense." "What if I never remember?" Carmen pulled him close. Then we'll help you make new memories, good ones, with everyone who loves you. It was Joe who accidentally triggered the first real memory. They were in the woods, building a fort from fallen branches, when she suggested they move it closer to the river. "We could make a little beach area," she said excitedly. "Put rocks in the water to make a dam." Alex's face went white. "No, not the river." "Why not? We're not going in the water, just near it." The angry man by the river, he." Alex's breathing accelerated, his eyes unfocused. "He said if I told anyone, he'd hurt Mom. He said it was my fault Dad left. He said..." "Alex!" Carmen grabbed his shoulders gently. "Stay with me. You're safe." "Who was the man?" But Alex was gone, lost in a panic attack, hyperventilating and crying. Carmen held him while Joe ran to get her phone to call Dr. Martinez. By the time the doctor arrived, Alex had calmed down, but the memory had retreated back into fog. He couldn't remember what he'd been saying, couldn't describe the man or explain the context. Dr. Martinez recorded everything Joe and Carmen had heard, and when she played it for Detective Ford, the investigation that had been cold for a year suddenly burned hot again. Detective Ford sat in her office, the recording of Alex's panic attack playing for the third time. "The angry man by the river. He said if I told anyone, he'd hurt Mom." She pulled up the original case file, looking at it with new eyes. They'd investigated everyone close to the Morrisons. Family, friends, business associates, household staff, but they'd been looking for someone who wanted to hurt Wesley or demand ransom. What if they should have been looking for someone who wanted to hurt the Morrisons by taking what they loved most? Jonathan Morrison had made enemies. That was clear from his business record. Companies he'd bought out, employees he'd fired, deals that had left people ruined. The original investigation had looked into all of them, but ransom had been the expected motive. What if the motive had been revenge? Ford pulled up the list of people with grudges against Jonathan Morrison. There were dozens, but most had alibis, or lived too far away, or were elderly or disabled in ways that made kidnapping a child impossible. She filtered the list, looking for anyone who'd been near the Morrison estate on the day of the disappearance, anyone with a connection to... She stopped, stared at a name. Lyle Rodriguez. Carmen Rodriguez's ex-husband, Joe's father, who disappeared from their lives 6 years ago, around the time Joe was 2. Ford's hands flew across the keyboard. Lyle Rodriguez had worked for Morrison Financial Holdings for 3 years until he was fired for embezzlement. He'd threatened Jonathan Morrison, had been escorted from the building. The case had been settled quietly. The Morrisons hadn't pressed charges in exchange for Lyle disappearing. But where had he disappeared to? Ford made phone calls, pulled records, traced a path. Lyle Rodriguez had bounced around the country for a year after his firing, working odd jobs under the table. Then he'd returned to the city 2 years ago. No permanent address, no employment records, but he'd been seen in the area of the Morrison estate multiple times, including the day of Wesley's birthday party. Ford's pulse quickened. She called Carmen. "Ms. Rodriguez, I need to ask you about your ex-husband, Lyle Rodriguez. When was the last time you saw him?" Carmen's voice was confused. "Lyle? He left when Joe was a baby. Why? Did you know he worked for Jonathan Morrison?" A long pause. "What?" "No. No, he worked construction. At least, that's what he told me. He worked for Morrison Financial Holdings. He was fired for embezzlement 4 years ago." Carmen's breath caught. "That can't be right. He left before that. Her voice changed, sharpening. "Oh my goodness, Detective, Lyle has been calling me for the past year. Unknown numbers, blocked numbers. I assumed it was bill collectors, so I stopped answering. But what if... Do you still have the phone with those calls?" "Yes, I never delete anything because I can't afford enough storage for new phones." Within an hour, Ford had a warrant for Carmen's phone records. The pattern was damning. Unknown numbers calling Carmen's phone starting 2 days after Wesley's disappearance. The calls came from different burner phones, but always followed a pattern, calling when Carmen would be at work, when a child might be home alone. Ford's theory crystallized. Lyle Rodriguez had taken Wesley Morrison to get revenge on Jonathan for destroying his career. But he'd had a problem: where to keep the kid. He couldn't keep him permanently without someone noticing. So he'd held Wesley somewhere for a year, maybe planning to ransom him eventually, maybe just enjoying watching the Morrisons suffer. But something had gone wrong. Wesley had escaped, or Lyle had panicked, or there'd been an accident. However it happened, Wesley had ended up in that river, and by sheer cosmic coincidence had been found by the daughter of his captor's ex-wife, who had pulled in out of the river. It was almost too perfect, which meant Ford was either exactly right or completely wrong. She brought the theory to the Morrisons. Wendy listened in growing horror. Jonathan's face went hard as stone. "Lyle Rodriguez," he said flatly. "I remember him. Thin guy, angry eyes. I fired him because he was stealing from clients. He threatened me. Said I'd ruined his life." Jonathan looked at his wife. Could it really be that simple? Revenge? "Where is he now?" Wendy asked. If he had Wesley for a year, he must be somewhere. That was the question Ford couldn't answer. Lyle Rodriguez had gone to ground. No credit cards, no bank accounts, no address. He was living off the grid, which meant he could be anywhere, but Ford had one advantage. Lyle didn't know they were looking for him. He thought Wesley was still safely hidden as Alex Rodriguez, living with his ex-wife. If he was keeping tabs on them, and the phone calls suggested he was, he'd be watching the house in the woods. Ford set up surveillance. She didn't tell Carmen, didn't tell the Morrisons. She just watched and waited. 3 days later, she got him. Lyle Rodriguez appeared at the edge of the woods near Carmen's house at 2 a.m. He stood in the shadows watching the cottage where his ex-wife slept, where his daughter dreamed, where the boy he'd held captive for a year was slowly healing. Ford's team moved in silently. Lyle ran, but he didn't get far. In the interrogation room, faced with evidence and the prospect of life in prison, Lyle Rodriguez began to talk. Lyle Rodriguez looked older than his 42 years. Prison pallor, despite not having been there yet. Hands that shook when he lit a cigarette, even though Ford had told him 3 times he couldn't smoke in here. "I didn't mean for it to go that far," he said finally. "I just wanted him to suffer. Morrison. The way he made me suffer. So you took his son. I watched him for months. His perfect life, perfect wife, perfect kid, perfect house. Everything I should have had if he hadn't destroyed me. Do you know what it's like to have everything taken away because of one mistake?" "Embezzling from clients isn't one mistake," Ford said evenly. "I was desperate. My wife had left, taken my daughter. I had child support I couldn't pay. I was just trying to survive, and Morrison fired me, blacklisted me, made sure I'd never work in finance again. So you decided to take his child." Lyle laughed, a bitter sound. "The plan was perfect. The birthday party, there were so many people, so much chaos. I posed as a caterer. No one questioned me and Wesley. He was just going inside to get a toy. I told him his mom sent me to help him find it. He trusted me. He came right along." Ford felt sick, but kept her expression neutral. "Where did you take him?" "A cabin upstate. I inherited it from my father. No one knows about it. It's not in my name. I drove there with Wesley in the trunk. When he woke up and realized what was happening..." Lyle's face twisted. He cried for his mother. For days, he cried. "You kept him there for a year." "I was going to ransom him. That was the original plan, but then it got complicated. The media coverage was bigger than I expected. The FBI got involved. I couldn't risk it, so I just kept him. I fed him, made sure he stayed alive. I tried to get him to understand that this was Morrison's fault, not mine. You told him it was his fault his father left. Lyle's eyes flickered. The divorce. I knew about it from following the news, so I used it. I told Wesley his parents split up because of him, because he wasn't good enough. I wanted Morrison to get his son back broken, you see? Destroyed like Morrison destroyed me. Ford wanted to hit him. She'd never wanted to hit a suspect before, but she wanted to hit Lyle Rodriguez. And then what? What happened that put him in the river? He tried to escape, multiple times. The last time I lost my temper, I locked him in a closet for 3 days as punishment. No food, little water. I wasn't trying to kill him, but when I opened the door, he was barely conscious and I panicked. The room was silent except for the hum of the recording equipment. I drove him back to the city at night. I was going to drop him at a hospital, leave him somewhere he'd be found, but he woke up in the car, started fighting me. We crashed, not bad, but enough to deploy the airbag. Wesley got out and ran into the woods, toward the river. I chased him, but it was dark, and he was fast, despite being weak. I heard a splash. By the time I got to the river, he was gone. I thought he'd drowned. I thought I'd killed him. So you left him there. What else could I do? If he was dead, I was a murderer. If he was alive and I pulled him out, I'd go to prison anyway. So I left. I went back to my car and left. Ford leaned forward. You left a dying child at a riverbank. I thought he was already dead. Lyle's voice rose. And then weeks later, I see Carmen has a foster kid. I see pictures Joe posts online. She's always on that damn phone. And I recognize him. Even with the longer hair, even skinnier, I recognize him. Why didn't you come forward? Are you kidding? With what I'd done? I figured if he lived with Carmen, he was safe. She'd take care of him. He was better off there than with Morrison anyway, and as long as no one knew who he really was, I was safe too. You used your ex-wife as an unknowing accomplice. I didn't use her. I didn't plan for him to end up with her. That was just... Lyle laughed again, that broken sound. Fate's joke. The universe has a sick sense of humor. Ford stood up. Lyle Rodriguez, you're under arrest for kidnapping, child endangerment, child abuse, and attempted murder. You have the right to remain silent. As she read him his rights, Ford thought about Wesley, about Alex, about a child who'd survived a year of torture by a man whose own failures had curdled into something monstrous. She thought about Carmen, who'd been trying to protect a child from dangers she couldn't name. She thought about Joe, who'd found a friend at a riverbank and gained a brother, and she thought about the Morrisons, who were about to learn exactly what had happened to their son. Dr. Martinez recommended telling Alex the truth in stages, but Wendy insisted on being there for all of it. He deserves to know, she said, sitting in the therapist's office with Carmen, Jonathan, and the doctor, and he deserves to hear it from people who love him. They told him together, all 4 adults, with Joe beside him holding his hand. They explained about Lyle Rodriguez, about the revenge plot, about the cabin and the year of imprisonment and the escape that nearly killed him. Alex listened silently, his face pale but composed. When they finished, he looked at Carmen. Did you know? Did you know it was your ex-husband? No, sweetheart, never. I haven't seen Lyle in years. If I'd known, if I'd had any idea. You saved me, Alex interrupted. You pulled me from the river. You took care of me. You loved me when I couldn't remember anyone else loving me. His eyes filled with tears. You didn't do anything wrong. Carmen pulled him into her arms, and they both cried, while Joe wrapped herself around them both, and Jonathan looked away, his jaw tight, and Wendy pressed her hands to her mouth. After a long moment, Alex pulled back. He looked at Wendy and Jonathan, really looked at them, and said the words that had been building for months. I think I want to try, to remember, to go home. The transition took time. Alex didn't move back to the Morrison mansion immediately. Instead, they started with longer visits, then overnight stays, then weekends. Carmen and Joe came too at first, a security blanket that made the big house less intimidating. Wesley, and he was Wesley now, trying on his old name like a coat he'd outgrown but was learning to wear again, started therapy 3 times a week. His memories returned in fragments, puzzle pieces that didn't always fit together, but slowly formed a picture. He remembered the birthday party, the bounce castle, going inside for his toy. He remembered Lyle approaching him, the confusion, then the growing fear. He remembered the cabin, the isolation, the psychological torture of being told his parents didn't want him, that it was his fault they'd separated. He remembered escaping, running through the dark woods with his heart pounding, the sound of Lyle behind him. The river appearing suddenly, the choice to jump rather than be caught, the cold water closing over his head, the struggle to reach the bank, then nothing until Carmen's voice telling him to stay with her. With each memory that returned, Wesley grieved. For the year he'd lost, for the childhood that had been stolen, for the fear that still woke him at night. But he also healed. Because now the fear had a name and a face, and names and faces could be dealt with. Lyle Rodriguez was sentenced to 30 years in prison. The judge called his crimes a level of cruelty beyond comprehension. Carmen attended the sentencing with Joe, needing to see the man who'd been the father of her child face justice. Lyle looked at her once, and she saw nothing in his eyes that resembled the man she'd once loved. "I'm sorry," he said as he was led away. "Tell Wesley I'm sorry." "Tell him yourself," Carmen replied, "when you see him in 30 years. If he chooses to forgive you, that's his decision, but I won't be your messenger." 6 months after Wesley's return, the Morrisons invited Carmen and Joe to dinner at the mansion. It was awkward at first, too many loaded histories, too many complicated emotions. But Joe and Wesley disappeared into his room within minutes, leaving the adults to navigate new territory. "I don't know how to thank you," Wendy said over coffee. "You saved his life. You gave him back to us." "I also kept him from you for months," Carmen replied. "I made choices that weren't mine to make." "You made choices that kept my son safe when I couldn't." Wendy's eyes filled with tears. "Jonathan and I have been going to therapy too, working through everything that happened before Wesley was taken. The truth is, our marriage was falling apart. We were so busy fighting each other that we didn't see the danger around our son. If Lyle hadn't taken him, something else might have. We were neglecting what mattered most." Jonathan, who'd been quiet, spoke up. "I fired Lyle Rodriguez without thinking about what he might do. I treated him like a problem to be eliminated, not a person. I never imagined he'd carry that rage far enough to hurt my child." He looked at Carmen. "You treated my son like a person, like someone worthy of love and care and patience. You gave him what we'd stopped giving each other, attention, time, and safety." Carmen felt her throat tighten. "He deserved it. Every child deserves it." "You're still in that small house in the woods," Wendy said carefully, "with the foster stipend barely covering rent." "We manage." "What if—" Wendy looked at Jonathan, who nodded. "What if you didn't have to just manage? We've been thinking about this for a while. We want to set up a trust fund for Joe, for her education, her future, and we want to buy the house you're renting, put it in your name free and clear." Carmen's hands shook. "You don't have to do that. We know we don't have to, we want to. Wesley is our son, but Joe is his sister in every way that matters. She held him when he had nightmares. She made him laugh when he'd forgotten how. Family isn't just blood, Carmen. We learned that the hard way." From upstairs came the sound of children laughing. Wesley and Joe playing some elaborate game that involved running between rooms and shrieking with joy. "There's one more thing," Jonathan said. "We know the judge ruled joint custody, but we want to make it official. Legal. You've been more than a foster mother to Wesley. We'd like you to be his godmother. Part of his life, permanently if you're willing. Carmen looked at these people who'd been strangers a year ago, who'd been adversaries 6 months ago, who were offering her family. Yes, she said, I'm willing. 1 year after Wesley's return, they all went back to the river. Not to the exact spot where Carmen had found him, that would have been too much, but to a place upstream where the water ran clear and gentle, where Joe and Wesley could wade in the shallows while the adults watched from the bank. It had been Dr. Martinez's idea. Reclaiming the space, she called it, taking a place of trauma and filling it with new, better memories. Carmen sat on a blanket with Wendy, watching the children splash each other and hunt for interesting rocks. Jonathan was further down the bank, talking on the phone about business, but even he checked in every few minutes to make sure Wesley was okay. He's doing well, Wendy said, following Carmen's gaze. Better than I hoped. The nightmares are less frequent. He's back in school full-time. His therapist thinks another year and he'll be ready to reduce sessions. And you? Carmen asked. How are you doing? Wendy was quiet for a moment. Learning, she finally said. Learning that my son isn't the same child who disappeared. He's been through things I can't imagine, changed in ways I'm still discovering, but he's also stronger, braver. He survived, Carmen. Against impossible odds, he survived. He's a fighter. He learned that from you. The way you fought for him, protected him, refused to give up even when it would have been easier. He talks about it sometimes, how you made him feel safe when nothing else did. Carmen felt tears prick her eyes. He made me better too, made me brave enough to fight for what mattered instead of just surviving. Joe's laugh rang out as Wesley showed her something he'd found, a piece of river glass worn smooth by water and time. They were building a collection together, a jar on Wesley's windowsill filled with treasures they'd found on their adventures. I was thinking, Wendy said carefully, about Wesley's birthday next month. His 8th birthday. Carmen tensed, remembering the 7th birthday party where everything had gone wrong. We want to keep it small this year, just family, and we were hoping you and Joe would come. Would stay the weekend, actually. Make it a celebration rather than just a party. Wendy, you don't have to. I want to. We want to. You are family Carmen. Not just because of what happened, but because of who you are. You saved my son's life. But more than that, you showed him what love looks like when everything else is falling apart. That's not something we can repay, but it is something we can honor by making sure you know you'll always have a place in our lives. Before Carmen could respond, Wesley ran up to them dripping wet and grinning. Joe was right behind him. Mama, Mrs. Morrison, look what we found! Wesley held out his hands, revealing 2 pieces of river glass, one blue, one green. They were right next to each other. Joe says it means they're meant to be together, like us. Wendy pulled Wesley into a hug, despite his wet clothes. Just like us, she agreed. That night, back at the house in the woods that Carmen now owned outright, she and Joe sat on their porch watching fireflies dance in the darkness. The woods no longer felt evil. They'd become a sanctuary, a place where healing happened. Mama, Joe asked, her voice thoughtful, do you think Wesley will ever be all the way okay? Carmen considered the question carefully. I think he'll always carry what happened to him, but I also think he'll be okay in spite of it. Maybe even because of it. Hard things can break us, or they can make us stronger. Wesley chose stronger because he had us. And because he's brave, braver than he knows. Joe was quiet for a moment. I'm glad we found him. I'm glad he's my brother. Me too, baby. Me too. Inside the house, Carmen's phone buzzed with a text from Wendy. Wesley wants to know if Joe can sleep over next Friday. Movie night and fort building. Please say yes. Carmen smiled and typed back. Yes, but only if you're prepared for 0 sleep. Joe's fort-building sessions last until dawn. The response came immediately. Perfect. That's exactly what we need. What they needed. Not what they had to do, or what they were obligated to do, but what they wanted. What would bring them all joy? Carmen looked out at the woods, at the path that led down to the river, where she'd found a dying child and gained a family. She thought about Lyle Rodriguez in prison, about the year of horror Wesley had endured, about her own struggles with poverty and eviction, and trying to do right in a world that made it hard. And she thought about how sometimes, despite everything, things worked out. Not perfectly, there was too much trauma for perfect, but right. In ways that mattered. Wesley would carry scars. They all would. But scars meant survival. Scars meant the wound had healed, even if it left a mark. 2 years later, the documentary premiered at the film festival to a standing ovation. The River's Gift. One child's journey from darkness to light told the complete story of Wesley's disappearance, Lyle's revenge plot, the year of captivity, the miraculous rescue, and the complicated road to healing that followed. But what made it special wasn't the dramatic story, it was the way it was told, through Wesley's own words. At 10 years old, Wesley Morrison had chosen to share his story. With his parents' support and Dr. Martinez's guidance, he'd sat for interviews, had talked about his experience with the kind of raw honesty that left viewers in tears. "I don't remember everything," he said, in one scene, sitting in the woods near the river. "My brain protected me from the worst parts, but I remember being scared. I remember thinking I'd never see my mom again, and I remember Carmen finding me. I remember her voice saying, 'Stay with me,' and I did. I stayed because someone wanted me to. Someone cared." The documentary showed his life now split between the Morrison mansion and Carmen's cottage, thriving in both places. It showed his friendship with Joe, now 10, and full of opinions about everything. It showed Wendy and Jonathan's journey through therapy, their recommitment to their marriage and their son. It showed Carmen's quiet strength, the way she'd fought for a child who wasn't hers, and gained a family in return. But the most powerful scene came at the end. Wesley stood at the riverbank where Carmen had found him, Joe beside him, both their parents, biological and chosen, behind them. He held a paper boat he'd made, filled with written memories of the past 2 years. His first day back at school, Joe's birthday party, the trip to Disney World with both families, his first soccer game, where everyone came to cheer, the nights watching movies curled up between Carmen and Wendy, the feeling of being safe enough to sleep without nightmares. "This river tried to take me," Wesley said to the camera, "but instead it brought me to the people I needed most. So I'm giving it something back, memories of being found, being loved, being saved. Not just once, but every day." He placed the boat in the water. They all watched it float away, carrying its precious cargo downstream, toward whatever came next. The documentary ended there with the image of that paper boat growing smaller in the distance, and these words on the screen: "Lyle Rodriguez is serving 30 years in prison. Wesley Morrison continues therapy and is thriving in school. Carmen Rodriguez works as a family advocate, helping other foster families. Joe Rodriguez wants to be a doctor, so I can save people like Mama saved Wesley." Wendy and Jonathan Morrison established the River's Gift Foundation, providing resources for families of missing children and survivors of trauma. And a child who was lost was found not once, but twice, first by the river, then by love. After the premiere, Carmen stood in the lobby surrounded by people wanting to congratulate her, to tell her how inspiring her story was, to ask how she'd found the courage to do what she did. But she was looking for Wesley, who'd slipped away from the crowd. She found him on the theater's back steps, looking up at the stars. "You okay?" she asked, sitting beside him. "Yeah." He leaned against her shoulder, a gesture that had become natural over the past 2 years. "I was just thinking about the boat, where it'll end up. Probably caught on some rocks downstream, Carmen said practically, making him laugh. Maybe. Or maybe it'll make it all the way to the ocean, and someone will find it and read what I wrote, and know that even when really bad things happen, you can still be okay. If you have people who love you. Carmen wrapped her arm around him. You're going to make me cry, and I'm all out of tissues. Good thing Joe always has tissues. He pulled a travel pack from his pocket with a grin. She made me bring these in case you got emotional. Smart girl. They sat in comfortable silence, watching the stars. Inside the theater, Carmen could hear Wendy's laugh, Jonathan's voice, Joe excitedly telling someone about the making of the documentary. Their family, complicated, unconventional, but real. Carmen, Wesley said quietly, thank you for not giving up on me even when you probably should have. Never, Carmen replied. Not ever. You're stuck with me, kiddo. Good, he said. That's exactly where I want to be. And under the stars, beside a child she'd pulled from a river and held through nightmares and watched blossom back into life, Carmen Rodriguez knew something with absolute certainty. She'd made mistakes, had lied and hidden and done things that weren't entirely right, but she'd also saved a life, and in saving his life, he'd saved hers. The river had taken a child and given back a family, and that was a gift worth more than any reward, any wealth, any perfectly planned life could ever be. It was the gift of love, found in the most unexpected places. It was the gift of hope, even in the darkest waters, and it was the gift of healing. One day, one moment, one act of kindness at a time. And it was enough. Sometimes we all need shelter, not just from rain, but from the storms of life, the bad days, the hard moments, the times when we feel utterly alone. In memory of everyone who's ever stood in the rain, feeling hopeless. In honor of everyone who's ever stopped to ask, "Are you okay?" In gratitude for the quiet heroes who transform grief into kindness, pain into purpose, and one simple act into a movement that changes lives. May we all be umbrellas for someone else's storm. God bless you.